The red clay of Pine Ridge, Georgia, was stubborn, but Silas Abernathy knew how to make it yield. For 3 generations, the Abernathy family had coaxed life from these 80 acres of pecan groves and sweet potato fields. It was a modest sanctuary, a patch of vibrant green surrounded by vast, corporate-owned cotton empires. To Silas, a broad-shouldered black man of 56 with hands as rough as tree bark and eyes that held the quiet patience of a mountain, this land was not just property. It was the physical manifestation of his grandfather's sweat and his late wife's memory. It was the soil that had paid for his son, Julian, to attend the state university to study agricultural engineering. On a stifling late August afternoon, the air hung thick with the scent of pine and coming rain. Silas stood by the rusted green tractor, watching Julian examine a cluster of pecan leaves. At 23, Julian possessed his father's quiet focus, but carried a sharp, modern intellect. He had returned from university with blueprints for a sustainable, solar-powered irrigation grid that could double their crop yield without depleting the local water table. "If we dig the secondary trench along the eastern boundary line, Dad," Julian said, pointing toward the edge of their property, where the lush pecan trees met a barbed wire fence, "we won't have to rely on the county's overpriced water main. We'll be completely self-sufficient." Silas smiled, a rare, warm expression that creased the weathered corners of his eyes. He placed a heavy, reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "Your grandfather used to carry water to these trees in wooden buckets, Julian. He always said, if you take care of the dirt will make sure you're never truly poor. You're making him proud, son." Their quiet moment of shared hope was abruptly shattered by the aggressive, roaring rev of a diesel engine. A massive, lifted black pickup truck kicked up a violent cloud of red dust as it screeched to a halt just inches from their eastern fence line. The passenger side window rolled down, revealing Garrett Sterling, the arrogant, 24-year-old son of the town's wealthiest real estate developer, Charles Sterling. With Garrett were 2 of his friends, all of them wearing matching local country club polo shirts, their faces flushed from midday drinking. "Hey, boy!" Garrett shouted, leaning his elbow on the window frame, his eyes dripping with ancestral condescension as he looked at Julian. "I told your old man last week to keep his trashy trees trimmed. Your branches are hanging over onto our family's commercial expansion plot. We've got bulldozers coming in next week to clear-cut that boundary." Julian stepped forward, his posture straight, refusing to be intimidated. "According to the county survey office, Garrett, those branches are at least 3 feet inside our registered property line. If your bulldozers touch our pecans, you're violating federal agricultural protection laws." Garrett's face twisted into an ugly, venomous sneer. He opened the truck door and stepped down onto the red dirt, his friends following close behind like a pack of loyal hyenas. "Let me tell you something, college boy," Garrett hissed, walking right up to the barbed wire fence, his voice dripping with systemic malice. "In this county, we decide where the lines are drawn. A piece of paper signed by a town clerk doesn't change the fact that this dirt belonged to my family before your people were even allowed to own a shovel. You and your daddy are occupying space that belongs to progress, and progress is coming." Silas stepped smoothly between his son and the barbed wire, his broad shoulders shielding Julian. He did not raise his voice, but the deep, resonant timbre of his words commanded the heavy air. "You are trespassing on Abernathy land, Garrett. I suggest you get back in your truck and drive away before I call the sheriff." Garrett laughed, a sharp, grating sound that echoed across the silent fields. "Call him. Sheriff Miller had dinner at my father's house last night." Without warning, Garrett reached into the bed of his lifted truck and pulled out a heavy, rust-stained crowbar. With a violent swing, he struck the wooden fence post. The aged timber splintered with a loud crack, the barbed wire snapping and coiling back like a struck snake. "Hey! What are you doing?" Julian yelled, moving instinctively forward to protect the boundary line. It was the exact excuse Garrett was waiting for. "He's attacking us," Garrett shouted with mock panic. Before Julian could react, one of Garrett's friends vaulted over the broken fence and blindsided him, driving a heavy fist into the young man's jaw. Julian stumbled backward, disoriented. Silas lunged forward to protect his son, but age and exhausted muscles betrayed him. The third young man tackled the older farmer from the side, driving a knee hard into Silas's ribs. The breath left Silas's lungs in a painful rush as he hit the hard clay. Through his blurred vision, Silas watched in absolute horror. Julian tried to defend himself, his university-trained mind no match for the brutal, coordinated street violence of three men. Garrett stepped forward, raising the heavy iron crowbar. With a sickening, metallic thud, he brought it down violently across Julian's ribs, then his shoulder. Julian collapsed into the red dirt, crying out in agony as blood began to pool beneath him, staining the very soil he had returned home to nurture. "That's for disrespecting your betters," Garrett spat, tossing the crowbar into the dirt near Julian's motionless body. The wail of a police siren pierced the muggy afternoon air. A county sheriff's cruiser tore down the dirt road, its lights flashing blindingly. Silas gasped for air, crawling desperately toward his bleeding son. "Thank God," Silas thought, his hands shaking as he pressed his jacket against Julian's bleeding head. Sheriff Miller, a heavy-set man with cold, indifferent eyes, stepped out of the cruiser. He did not unholster his weapon. He did not rush to the bleeding boy on the ground. Instead, he casually walked over to Garrett, placing a friendly hand on the young man's shoulder. "What happened here, Garrett?" Sheriff Miller asked smoothly. "Self-defense, Sheriff." Garrett lied without missing a beat, pointing at the crowbar in the dirt. "Julian came at us with a deadly weapon. We had to subdue him." Silas stared in absolute disbelief. "He is lying. They trespassed. They nearly killed my boy." Silas roared, his voice cracking with desperation and rage. Sheriff Miller slowly turned his gaze to Silas, his eyes as hard as flint. "Silas, I see 3 upstanding young men with minor bruises, and your boy bleeding next to a weapon on the ground. If you want, I can arrest Julian right now for aggravated assault. Or, you can put him in your truck, take him to the county hospital, and we forget this little misunderstanding ever happened." The raw, suffocating weight of systemic injustice crushed the air from Silas's lungs. He looked at the corrupt sheriff, then at the smirking face of Garrett Sterling, and finally down at his son, whose breathing was becoming dangerously shallow. The law was not here to protect him. It was here to remind him of his place. The sterile smell of bleach and isopropyl alcohol in the county hospital corridor offered no comfort to Silas. He sat on a stiff plastic chair, his head buried in his rough, soil-stained hands. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead felt like a physical pressure against his temples. Julian was still in the intensive care unit, breathing with the assistance of a ventilator. The doctors had confirmed 3 broken ribs, a severely fractured collarbone, and a deep concussion that had caused minor swelling in his brain. Just after dawn, a heavy-set doctor in green scrubs walked out of the double doors. Dr. Evans did not look at Silas. His eyes were fixed on the clipboard in his hands. "Mr. Abernathy," the doctor began, his tone professional yet completely devoid of warmth. "Your son is stable, but the internal bleeding required emergency surgery. He will need to remain in ICU for at least another week, followed by extensive physical therapy for his shoulder." Silas stood up, his joints popping from exhaustion. "Thank you, doctor. Can I see him?" "In a moment," Dr. Evans replied, finally looking up. "But first, the billing administration needs to speak with you." because the incident report filed by Sheriff Miller classifies this as a violent altercation initiated by the victim. Your private agricultural insurance policy will not cover a single cent of Julian's medical expenses. The current bill stands at $45,000. And that is before the physical therapy. Silas felt the room tilt. 45,000? Doctor, my son was attacked. He didn't initiate anything. That is a legal matter for the sheriff's department, Mr. Abernathy. As far as the hospital is concerned, the deposit must be cleared by tomorrow afternoon, or we will have to transfer Julian to the state charity facility 2 hours away. With his brain swelling, a transfer right now is highly risky. Before Silas could even process the crushing weight of the doctor's words, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a call from Arthur Pendleton, the head loan officer at Pine Ridge Community Bank, the only bank in the county that handled agricultural mortgages. Silas stepped into the quiet stairwell to answer. Arthur, please tell me the crop loan went through. Silas, I'm sorry. Arthur's voice was smooth, but there was a distinct coldness to it. The board reviewed your application this morning. In light of the civil disturbance on your property yesterday, and the pending assault allegations against your son, the bank has decided to deny your extension. Furthermore, we are calling in your outstanding equipment mortgage. My equipment mortgage? That's not due for another 6 months. Silas gasped, his hand gripping the handrail so tightly his knuckles turned white. There is a standard morality and risk clause in your contract, Silas, Arthur explained, his tone completely indifferent. A violent incident on the mortgaged property constitutes a default risk. We need the full balance of $30,000 by Friday. Of course, Charles Sterling's development group has offered to buy your eastern acreage for $60,000. That would clear all your bank debt and Julian's hospital bills in one afternoon. I strongly suggest you take the deal. Silas leaned against the cold concrete wall, the trap closing in on him. The assault, the hospital bills, the canceled loan, and the sudden demand for mortgage payment, it was not a chain of unfortunate events. It was a perfectly coordinated, bloodless eviction designed to strip him of his family's legacy. Silas drove back to the farm under a gray, suffocating sky. The 80 acres of pecan trees, which usually filled him with a profound sense of peace, now looked like a battlefield he was losing. He needed help, not just financial, but community support. The Abernathy family had been part of Pine Ridge for nearly a century. They had helped build the local church, shared their tractors during harvest seasons, and supported their neighbors through droughts. Surely, Silas thought, someone would stand with them. His first stop was the local cooperative supply store. He needed to secure fertilizer on credit, a standard arrangement he had utilized every autumn for 20 years. As Silas stepped inside, the usual friendly chatter of the farmers gathered near the counter died instantly. The store manager, Marcus Vance, an older man who had known Silas since childhood, avoided his gaze, pretending to study a shipping manifest. "Morning, Marcus," Silas said, stepping up to the counter. "I need to log the standard order for the winter crop fertilizer. Just put it on my tab." Marcus slowly set his pen down, his face a mask of awkward discomfort. He did not look Silas in the eye. "Can't do it, Silas. Corporate policy changed this morning. All accounts with outstanding legal complications are strictly cash only. No more credit lines." "Legal complications?" Silas asked, his voice low and tight. "My son is fighting for his life in the ICU because he was attacked by Garrett Sterling. You know Julian, Marcus. You watched him grow up. He wouldn't hurt a fly." "It doesn't matter what I know, Silas," Marcus muttered, his voice barely a whisper as he glanced nervously at the other patrons. Carl Sterling owns the land this cooperative sits on. He owns the commercial trucks we use. People around here have families to feed. Nobody can afford to be seen taking your side. It's best you just pay your debts and move on. The isolation was not limited to the store. When Silas arrived at the local community church that evening for the weekly prayer circle, the cold shoulder was devastatingly clear. As he walked down the aisle of the wooden chapel, families who had sat next to him for decades quietly gathered their coats and moved to the opposite side of the sanctuary. The whispers were sharp and venomous. They say his boy Julian started a fight with the Sterling boy. Typical. They get that university education and think they can challenge the folks who run this town. They're going to lose that farm anyway. Best to stay away from a sinking ship. Reverend Thomas, a man Silas had personally helped raise funds for to repair the church roof, approached him after the service. He did not offer a handshake. "Silas," the Reverend said softly, his tone dripping with patronizing pity. "These are troubled times for your family. Perhaps it would be best if you and Julian took some time away from the congregation. Your presence, it's causing a lot of friction among the members." "The Sterlings are major benefactors of our youth programs, Silas. We must keep the peace." "The peace?" Silas asked, his heart hardening into a block of ice. "My son's blood is still fresh in the red dirt of my farm. Reverend, where is the justice in your peace?" The Reverend had no answer. He simply bowed his head and walked away. Silas walked out of the church into the quiet, dark night. He was completely alone. The bank, the hospital, the law, and now his own community had been weaponized against him. They wanted him to bend. They wanted him to break and hand over the deeds to his ancestors' sweat. But as Silas looked up at the towering pecan trees whispering in the wind, a cold, unyielding resolve took root deep inside his chest. They had the power, but he had the truth and he was not leaving. The harsh, rhythmic click hiss of the ventilator was the only sound keeping Silas anchored to reality. He sat in the darkened ICU room, holding his son's limp, IV-bruised hand. It was 3:10 a.m. The swelling in Julian's brain had finally subsided enough for the doctors to remove the breathing tube, but the young man remained in a deep, medicated sleep. His chest was wrapped in tight white bandages, holding his broken ribs in place. Silas leaned forward, resting his forehead against Julian's cold knuckles. The exhaustion was a physical ache in his bones, but his mind was remarkably clear. The fear that had paralyzed him for the last 48 hours had burned away, leaving behind a cold, crystalline anger. "I'm sorry, Julian," Silas whispered, his voice cracking in the quiet room. "I told you that if you worked hard, if you got your education, the world would treat you fair. I lied to you, son. I wanted so badly to believe the lie myself." A tear slipped down Silas's weathered cheek, dampening his son's hand. "They think they can starve us out. They think they can use their banks and their badges to erase 90 years of our family's sweat. But they don't know the roots of those pecan trees, Julian. They don't know how deep they go." Julian's fingers twitched slightly. His eyelids fluttered open, his gaze unfocused and hazy from the pain medication. He looked at his father, his voice nothing more than a raspy, painful whisper. "Dad, the farm," Garrett said. "Don't you worry about Garrett, and don't you worry about the farm," Silas interrupted gently, squeezing his hand. "You did nothing wrong, Julian. You stood up for what's ours. Your only job right now is to heal. I'm going to handle the rest." They have everyone, Dad," Julian whispered, a tear of frustration pooling in his eye. "The bank, the sheriff. They have the town, Julian. But they don't own the truth," Silas said, his voice hardening, his eyes locking onto his son's with absolute, terrifying certainty. "I swear to you, on your mother's memory and your grandfather's grave, They will not take one single handful of our dirt. I am going to bring them down, Julian. All of them. Julian closed his eyes, comforted by the fierce, protective aura of his father, and drifted back to sleep. Silas stood up, kissed his son's forehead, and walked out of the hospital into the cool, pre-dawn air. He didn't drive back to the farm to sleep. Instead, he drove straight to the old wooden tool shed behind his house. There, tucked away in the back under a heavy canvas tarp, sat his grandfather's heavy iron footlocker. It hadn't been opened since Silas was a boy. It was time to dig into the past. The heavy padlock on the iron footlocker yielded with a dry, metallic screech under the force of Silas's wrench. Silas lifted the rusted lid, releasing a cloud of dust that smelled of dry paper, cedar, and decades of forgotten history. Inside lay the preserved remnants of his family's survival: old leather-bound ledgers, yellowed photographs of proud black men and women standing in front of mule-drawn carts, and at the very bottom, a thick, wax-sealed cylinder. Silas pulled the cylinder out, his rough fingers trembling slightly as he uncapped it. He slid out a heavy, parchment document dated November 14, 1882. It was the original land grant deed for the 80 acres, signed during the Reconstruction era. As Silas carefully unfolded the fragile paper under the dim light of a single hanging bulb, his eyes scanned the elegant, cursive script. He wasn't just looking for sentimental value. He was looking for a weapon. Silas had remembered his grandfather speaking of an old right of ancestral occupancy and sovereign agricultural tenure clause, a rare legal protection granted to newly freed families who purchased government-forfeited plantation lands in the late 19th century. He tracked the faded ink down to the bottom third of the document, where a bolded, hand-written addendum stood out. And be it enacted, that this parcel of land shall remain immune to any state or county municipal seizure, foreclosure, or forced commercial partition, provided that the soil is continuously cultivated by the direct descendants of the grantee, and that no public utility or municipal easement has been granted by said family. Any attempt by external financial institutions or local authorities to forcibly acquire or restrict access to this parcel shall immediately trigger a federal judicial review, stripping local courts of jurisdiction. Silas's breath caught in his throat. He read the clause 3 times to make sure his exhausted mind wasn't playing tricks on him. Because the Abernathys had refused to connect to the municipal water main, maintaining their own well system and using their own solar setup, they had never granted a single public easement to the county. And because they had farmed the land continuously for 94 years without a break, the protection was fully active. This meant the Pine Ridge Community Bank had absolutely no legal authority to foreclose on the property under local county laws. Any foreclosure attempt would automatically move the case out of Sheriff Miller's corrupt jurisdiction and directly into a federal court in Atlanta, far beyond the reach of Charles Sterling's bribe money. Silas stood up, his spine straightening as if a massive physical weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The local bank, the sheriff, and the Sterling family had been playing a game of intimidation because they knew they couldn't win a game of law. They needed Silas to sign the land over voluntarily because, on paper, Silas was untouchable. Silas carefully rolled the parchment back into its protective sleeve and placed it inside his leather work bag. The quiet farmer was gone. He was now a defender armed with a century of his ancestors' protection. He walked out to his truck, turned the key, and headed toward the city limits. His destination was not the local courthouse, but the offices of a federal civil rights attorney in Atlanta who owed Silas's late brother a lifetime favor. The towering glass skyscrapers of downtown Atlanta felt like a different universe to Silas. He sat in a sleek, sunlit office on the 24th floor, watching Eleanor Vance, the daughter of his late brother's closest friend, and now a formidable federal civil rights attorney examine the fragile parchment document through white cotton gloves. Her sharp, analytical eyes darted across the faded ink of the 1882 deed, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across her face. "Silas, this is incredible," Eleanor said, setting her reading glasses down. "Most families lost these deeds during the Jim Crow era due to courthouse fires or simple theft. The fact that your grandfather kept this locked in an iron box is a miracle." "Does it hold up, Eleanor?" Silas asked, his voice low and weary. "The bank is demanding $30,000 by Friday, and the hospital is threatening to move Julian tomorrow." Eleanor leaned forward, her expression hardening into pure determination. "Hold up, Silas? This doesn't just hold up, it's a legal nuclear option. Under the Reconstruction Land Tenure Act of 1882, because you've never granted a county easement and have maintained continuous cultivation, local jurisdiction is completely barred. Pine Ridge Community Bank cannot foreclose. If they try, they are committing federal bank fraud." She tapped her fingers on the mahogany desk. "But we have to play this smart. If we file this in the local Pine Ridge courthouse, Sheriff Miller and Charles Sterling will find a way to make the paperwork disappear. We are going to bypass them entirely." Eleanor stood up, walking over to her computer. "I am drafting an emergency federal injunction right now. We are going to freeze any debt collection, halt any foreclosure proceedings, and mandate that Julian cannot be moved from the ICU due to his critical condition. I am also filing a formal request for the Department of Justice to investigate Sheriff Miller's department for civil rights violations and falsifying police reports." She looked back at Silas, her eyes burning with a fierce protective light. "Go back to Pine Ridge, Silas. Stand on your land. Do not sign a single paper. Do not speak to Garrett or Charles Sterling. And do not show them this deed. Let them think they have you cornered. Let them make their move on Friday. And when they do, we will spring the trap." Silas felt the cold knot of dread in his stomach finally dissolve, replaced by a solid, unyielding strength. "Thank you, Eleanor. My grandfather always said this dirt had a voice. I guess it's finally time for the world to hear it." He shook Eleanor's hand, took his leather bag, and walked out of the office. As he drove back toward the red clay of Pine Ridge, Silas looked at the passenger seat, where the deed lay safely sealed. For decades, his family had kept their heads down, working the soil, trying to survive in a system designed to see them fail. But the survival era was over. It was time to fight. Friday morning arrived with an ominous, suffocating humidity. Silas stood on his wooden porch, a steaming mug of black coffee in his hands, watching the dirt road. The 80 acres of pecan trees stood silent, their leaves heavy with dew. At exactly 9:00 a.m., the quiet was broken by the sound of 3 vehicles approaching. Leading the convoy was Sheriff Miller's cruiser, followed by a sleek silver Mercedes belonging to Charles Sterling, and a flatbed tow truck from the bank, ready to repossess Silas's tractor. The vehicles kicked up a thick wall of red dust as they stopped at the broken fence line. Garrett Sterling jumped out of the Mercedes first, a triumphant, mocking grin plastered across his face. Beside him walked his father, Charles Sterling, a man with sharp, predatory eyes and a tailored gray suit that looked entirely out of place in the Georgia dirt. Sheriff Miller stepped out of his cruiser, his hand resting casually on his gun belt, accompanied by Arthur Pendleton, the nervous-looking bank officer. Silas did not run. He did not yell. He slowly walked down the porch steps, carrying only his leather work bag, and met them at the boundary line. "Silas," Arthur Pendleton said, stepping forward with a stack of foreclosure documents. "It is 9 a.m. You haven't wired the $30,000 for the equipment mortgage, and the hospital has informed us you haven't cleared Julian's surgical deposit. We are here to execute the immediate repossession of your machinery and serve the eviction notice for the eastern 40 acres to settle your bank debt." Charles Sterling took a step forward, adjusting his gold watch. "Let's make this easy on everyone, Silas. Sign the deed transfer for the eastern plot over to my development group right now. I'll personally clear your bank debt and pay off the hospital. Your boy gets to stay in his bed, and you get to keep your house. Otherwise, the sheriff here is going to escort you off this property." Garrett laughed from behind his father. "Better sign it, old man. Unless you want to go to jail like your son." Silas looked at Garrett, then at Charles, and finally at Sheriff Miller. He let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds. "I'm not signing anything," Silas said, his voice as steady as granite. Sheriff Miller sighed, stepping forward and unclipping his handcuffs. "Silas, don't make this hard. You're in default, and I have a county court order to assist in the repossession and eviction. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." "You don't have jurisdiction here, Sheriff," Silas replied quietly. "What did you say?" Miller sneered, reaching for Silas's arm. Silas did not flinch. He reached into his leather bag, pulled out a fresh, officially sealed federal document, and handed it directly to Sheriff Miller. "That is an emergency federal injunction issued 3 hours ago by the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia." Miller's smirk vanished. He snatched the paper, his eyes scanning the bold, federal seal at the top. Arthur Pendleton leaned in, his face suddenly pale. "What is this nonsense?" Charles Sterling snapped, his voice losing its polished composure. "It's a federal freeze on all foreclosure and repossession actions against this property," Silas explained, his voice echoing across the quiet field. "Under the Reconstruction Land Tenure Act of 1882, this land is immune to county seizure. My attorney has also filed a formal request for a federal investigation into your bank, Arthur, for predatory lending and fraud." And Sheriff Miller, Silas locked eyes with the officer. "Federal marshals are currently reviewing your falsified police report regarding my son's assault. The Department of Justice is handling this case now." A dead, terrified silence fell over the group. The tow truck driver, realizing what was happening, immediately put his truck in reverse and began backing down the road, wanting no part in a federal crime. You think some old piece of paper is going to stop me?" Charles Sterling hissed, his face twisting in rage as he glared at Silas. "It already has," Silas said softly, pointing down the road. In the distance, 2 black SUVs with federal government plates were speeding toward the farm, their sirens silent, but their authority absolute. The trap had been sprung. The 2 black federal SUVs pulled up to the fence line, their doors opening in unison to reveal 4 armed U.S. Marshals and an investigator from the Department of Justice. Charles Sterling stepped back, his expensive leather shoes sinking into the damp red clay. His polished, powerful demeanor shattered in an instant. "Carl Sterling? Sheriff Miller?" the lead investigator asked, flashing a gold badge that caught the harsh morning sun. "I am Special Agent Vance. We are here to enforce a federal protection order on this property and serve subpoenas regarding a civil rights and wire fraud conspiracy investigation." Sheriff Miller's hand drifted away from his gun belt, his face turning an ash-gray color. "Agent, this is just a local land dispute. There's been a mistake." "The only mistake, Sheriff, was thinking your county badge shielded you from federal law," Agent Vance interrupted coldly. "We have already seized the security footage from the town cooperative and the hospital's billing logs. We also have a signed affidavit from the county clerk detailing how Charles Sterling pressured her to alter the municipal survey maps of the Abernathy property. Arthur Pendleton, the bank officer, practically fell over himself as he backed away toward his car. I was just following bank board orders. I had nothing to do with the physical assault. You'll have plenty of time to explain that to a federal grand jury, Mr. Pendleton, the agent replied. Two marshals stepped forward, politely but firmly directing Charles Sterling, his pale and trembling son Garrett, and Sheriff Miller to step away from Silas's land. Silas stood on his soil, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the men who had tried to destroy his family turn on each other. Garrett, who had proudly swung a heavy iron crowbar just days before, was now hiding behind his father, his eyes wide with terror, as he realized his family's money could not buy his way out of federal prosecution. This isn't over, Silas, Charles Sterling hissed, though his voice lacked any real conviction as a marshal escorted him back toward his Mercedes. It was over 94 years ago, Charles, Silas said, his voice quiet, calm, and filled with the weight of generations. You just didn't read the history. By that afternoon, the news of the federal intervention had swept through Pine Ridge like a wildfire. The invisible wall of isolation that had surrounded Silas began to crumble. Phones rang constantly with apologies from neighbors who had turned their backs, and the bank's board of directors issued a formal, public apology to the Abernathy family, completely erasing the equipment mortgage to avoid further federal lawsuits. But Silas didn't care about their apologies. He packed his leather bag, locked his front door, and drove back to the Atlanta hospital. When he walked into the recovery ward, he found Julian sitting up in bed, the ventilator gone, his eyes bright and alert. We did it, son, Silas said, walking to the bedside and wrapping his arms gently around his recovering boy. The land is ours. It's always going to be ours. 3 months later, the golden hour sun painted the rolling hills of Pine Ridge in shades of deep amber and violet. The red clay, once a silent witness to the attempted theft of a legacy, now felt different, softer, perhaps, or simply more at peace. Silas stood on the edge of the eastern property line, his hands buried deep in the soil. It was rich, cool, and gave way easily. Beside him stood Julian. He was thinner than before, a jagged, fading scar running along his collarbone, but he stood with a posture that carried the weight of a man who had stared into the abyss and walked away untouched. The solar-powered irrigation grid Julian had designed was fully operational, humming with a faint, steady rhythm, pushing water through the lines to the thirsty pecan trees. It was a victory of innovation over intimidation. The town had changed, too. The silence that had once been filled with avoidance was now punctuated by hesitant nods and polite greetings. When Silas went to the cooperative to pick up supplies, Marcus, the manager, no longer avoided his eyes. He had offered a sincere, albeit quiet, apology for his cowardice, a sentiment Silas had accepted without warmth, but with the dignity of a man who had moved past the need for their validation. The Sterlings had faded from local power, with Charles and Garrett facing federal indictment, and the family's commercial holdings tied up in decades of litigation. The Sterling development era had collapsed as quickly as it had begun. The soil moisture is perfect, Julian said, checking a digital sensor on his handheld monitor. These trees are going to produce the best harvest we've seen in 20 years, Dad. Silas looked up at the towering canopy of pecans. The leaves rustled in the evening breeze, a sound that, to Silas, was no longer just the wind, it was a chorus. He felt the phantom presence of his grandfather, of the generations who had bled, wept, and thrived on this very plot of land. They had built a wall of silence around this family, but they hadn't realized that for the Abernathys, silence wasn't a sign of weakness, it was a form of endurance. You know, Julian, Silas said, wiping the dirt from his hands onto his worn denim jeans. People think land is something you own. They think if you have enough money or enough influence, you can cut it up, pave it over, and claim it's yours. But the land doesn't belong to any of us. We belong to it. Julian looked at his father, his expression softening with a profound, quiet understanding. I know, Dad. I didn't get it before, not fully. I thought the blueprints and the solar grids were about protecting an investment. But I see now. It was about protecting us. About protecting the only place where we are allowed to be completely free. Silas smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that reached his eyes. He reached down and picked up a handful of the red earth, letting it sift slowly through his fingers, drifting back onto the rows they had defended. The storm had passed, the Goliaths had fallen, and the Abernathys remained. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, peaceful shadows over the orchard, father and son stood in silence. They were not just farmers anymore. They were the guardians of a history that could no longer be erased. The soil of Pine Ridge would keep their secrets, nourish their future, and forever remember the names of the men who refused to let it go. The roots of the Abernathy family had always been deep,